Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. Now, I was planning on doing my account of the Gebethel ritual as a video today, but I've been sick the last week, so I haven't had time to prepare. But I wanted to cover a topic which is a good segue into that, which is to do with magic in the Bible. And what exactly does the Bible say about magic? So that's what I'm going to be covering today. Now, in the context of Enochian magic, which I've been talking about a lot recently, obviously, John Dee was a very religious man, a very Christian man, and in his own mind, he was able to reconcile his faith and his belief in the Bible with his practice of the occult arts, such as using magic to summon angels and communicate with them. But not all Christians were as tolerant towards magic as Dee himself was, and we saw a real transformation in that start to happen, particularly in Dee's own lifetime. John Dee was the court astrologer, the advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and later in his lifetime, King James I came to power, and he was not able to curry favour with James I in the same way that he was with Elizabeth I, because King James was virulently opposed to anything occult, anything magical. He wanted to eliminate it. The witch hunting craze was contemporary with his time. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch's hammer, the notorious book that stoked the flames of that period. And King James himself was so anti-magic that he actually, in his new translation of the Bible, the famous King James version that we know today, changed the translation of a critical word in that infamous verse about not suffering a witch to live, to say quite clearly that it was referring to witches. All witches, all those who practice magic. Whereas in the Latin Vulgate version before that, it was simply those who practice evil, perhaps evil magic. And before that, it had a more ambiguous and up for debate definition again. But King James had an agenda, and he twisted the meaning of the Bible to reflect that in his translation. And so today we have this really black and white view of magic in the Christian world, that it's all damnable, that it's all wrong. Whereas if you actually look at what the Bible says and what is presented in the stories of the Bible, there are prohibitions on specific forms of magic and specific forms of divination, but not a blanket ban. And in fact, we see figures in the Bible engaging in activity which could be described as magical or divinatory. Now, just a disclaimer, because I know this is the internet and I know how much things can get misinterpreted and how easily. I'm not saying that everybody should obey the first 5 books of the Bible. I'm just presenting this as an academic discussion on what those books say, because they're often used as a justification for some really extreme ideas about magic and divination. So there are a number of instances that we can find in the Bible which point to the use of magic or divination by the protagonists of the story. One such episode is in the book of Exodus. Of course, we have Moses when he has returned from his vision of the burning bush back to Egypt to liberate the Hebrews. He confronts Pharaoh and he uses his staff and transforms the staff into a snake. And the court magicians of the Pharaoh from Egypt are able to replicate that miracle, so they too turn their staves into serpents. When Moses uses his staff to turn the river into blood, the Egyptian magicians again able to replicate that miracle. If these two tricks look the same, they must be the same thing. That's what it strongly suggests. And so Moses himself was practicing magic, the same kind of magic that the Egyptian priests were practicing. But this was before the law. This was before Moses' covenant between the Israelites and God. And when that covenant was handed down and the mitzvot were handed down, there were a number of prohibitions that appeared in there, some of which applied to specific kinds of magic or divination. But there were other forms of magic or divination that were allowed in the Bible. One example of divination in the Bible is the use of the Israelite priests of the two stones of the Urim and Thummim. These were a black and white stone, which were, one was black, one was white, and they were used for some kind of oracular or divinatory activity. There's been a lot of speculation about this. Some people have suggested that much like runes, they would have been put in a bag and then drawn at random, and to draw one color would indicate a yes answer, and to draw another would indicate a no answer. But this is something that the priests of the tabernacle did regularly to divine the will of God on particular questions. There is also an example of a curse in the book of Numbers. A curse whereby if a man's wife is accused of adultery, there's a ritual she can go through where she drinks a cup of water mixed in with some dust from the floor of the holy place, before that reciting an oath to God saying, if I lie about what I've done, may your judgment come upon me, or something along those lines. But this is clearly a magical ritual. Interestingly and ironically, but perhaps not surprisingly, there's no equivalent for an adulterous man in the Bible. And what's more, this is clearly a curse. It's clearly a curse, which means that the prohibition on certain types of magic isn't even as broad as black magic and white magic. It's even more specific than that. So what does the Bible say about the types of magic or divination that are prohibited? Well, there are a number of different terms in Hebrew that are used throughout the Old Testament for types of witchcraft and types of divination, which have all been translated to mean witch or wizard or sorcerer as just a blanket term. But they meant very specific things. One such term in Exodus 22:18 is mechashafah, which has been translated to mean witch, but the translation in reality is a lot more ambiguous, but a very compelling indication we have from the Septuagint translation, which was undergone by very scholarly Jews who understood both Greek and Hebrew, is that this actually refers to poisoners, herbalists who used herbal concoctions to poison people and do other nefarious kinds of activities. So then we have this specific term referring to poisoners, and this is the thing that is being forbidden. This specific kind of what was seen as a form of sorcery back then is being forbidden. And what's interesting is the Greek translation of this word, pharmakeia, is used in Revelation 18:23, and you might recognize this word. It might sound familiar. That's because the Greek word pharmakeia is actually the etymological root of our modern English words pharmacy and pharmaceutical. So another biblical verse that deals with forbidden forms of magic and divination is Leviticus 19:26. It talks about what is translated as divination and soothsaying. But it seems like what is being indicated here is, again, specific kinds of practice. The verses which deal with divination and soothsaying here are grouped together with other verses which indicate things that were forbidden as a group because they were pagan practices of a pagan people, which may or may not have a spiritual significance to them. So directly before the prohibition on divination and soothsaying, we have prohibition on eating meat that still has the blood in it. which could be a practice. It could be a pagan spiritual practice interpreted in that way. And then directly after that, we have the prohibitions on rounding off the side of the head by cutting the hair and marring the beard by trimming the beard, which could be, like a Bronze Age fashion among pagan people, or it could have a spiritual significance in terms of cutting the hair to make an offering to the gods. So all of these indicate cultural practices that are pagan in nature, and so too the forms of divination and soothsaying being referred to are likely specifically pagan types, because again we've seen that there's a not forbidden type of divination in the form of the oracles of the Urim and the Thummim. Divination here, tenachashu, could be referring to of reading the entrails of an animal which had its life taken, which would link back nicely to the previous verse about blood. And you see this divination method depicted in the HBO series Rome, and also in the Exodus movie with Christian Bale. It could also be linked to the pagan practice of reading augurs, of augury, that is to set a group of birds free and to read into the way that they fly as a method of divination. This again was depicted in HBO's Rome series. Soothsaying, teonenu, is also translated as reading the times, observing the times. This could be to do with pagan superstitions around good or bad times to do something, such as today. The modern equivalent would be, I better not do that today because it's Friday the 13th. It could also be related to reading signs in the clouds, of interpreting meteorological phenomena as a form of divination. But the important thing to note here is it's not the practice of divination itself that makes it forbidden. It's the fact that it is linked to practices of a pagan people, and this in the context where God wants the Israelites to set themselves apart from the pagans around them and live a different lifestyle to them, and also to follow that one particular God rather than appealing to these other gods, and also listening to the commandments of that particular God, not the customs of foreign people that follow foreign gods. And there's a kind of association with not becoming defiled, which runs through these verses and the reason for the prohibition in these verses, as well as some other verses which I'll discuss now. So Leviticus 19:31 and 20:27 talk about a prohibition on consulting the Olb and the Yidioni, which is translated as mediums and their familiar spirits. So this again is referring to a specific type of practice, essentially necromancy. It's talking about a practice where a witch or a medium will call upon the spirits of the dead, or will call upon familiar spirits and ask them for favors or for information. And again, we have an association between this practice and defilement. And I think there's really two reasons for that. One, as I previously discussed with the other verses, it's because God had asked the Israelites to have a special relationship with Him, and this was asking spiritual beings other than God for help. So it was profaning in that sense, and thus a defilement. But also it could be related to the spirits being called upon being spiritually unclean. There were other prohibitions on touching corpses because of the physical uncleanness. There were prohibitions on eating certain kinds of animals for their physical uncleanness. Perhaps these familiar spirits and these spirits of the dead called up from Sheol were regarded as contaminating the person who makes contact with them with some kind of spiritual uncleanliness. So those are kind of the reasons why these particular types of magic or divination were prohibited in Leviticus and the other books of the Pentateuch. And interestingly, we have a story in 1 Samuel where Saul, who was the first king of Israel, who was falling into wickedness at that time, falling out of God's favour, tried to consult the Urim and the Thummim to gain an answer to his question, was unsuccessful, and then went to a figure who's called the Witch of Endor, who was a necromancer, who conjured the soul that had passed of the prophet Samuel to answer Saul's question. And this is presented as a sign of Saul's moral decline, that he was abandoning the rights and the customs of his own people for those of the surrounding tribes. But it was not the act of divination itself that is presented as wrong. So the criteria, in summary, for what separates magic forbidden in the Bible from not forbidden is, one, is it something which indicates that you are asking God for help and no other spirit or force other than God? And two, does it create some kind of a physical or spiritual defilement for you to engage in that kind of practice? And there are things later in the history of monotheism and Abrahamic religion which contradict the idea that there was this black and white answer to whether or not magic and divination were banned in the Bible. And that is the fact that you've got entire traditions that emerged of Gnostic Christian magic and Jewish magic as well, in the form of the practical Kabbalah and other forms of Kabbalah. And of course, no discussion on magic in the Bible would be complete without bringing up Jesus. And in fact, in a lot of artworks in the early centuries of the Christian era, Jesus, when he is performing miracles, such as this depiction from the 3rd century of the Common Era of Jesus resurrecting Lazarus, he's actually depicted with a magic wand. So Jesus was considered a magician. His miracles were considered to be magical in nature in the very early years of Christianity among some believers. In the Gnostic book of Jehu, which is said to have been given by Jesus himself, not sure how historical that claim is, that's the origin of those teachings, but it does take place in a Gnostic Christian tradition, and it does give a series of symbols and incantations to use to try and get past the archons of the spheres who are gatekeeping and trying to stop the divine spark of human beings from ascending back to heaven. The practical Kabbalah calls upon angels to try and engage in practical magic, basically. And, rabbis are split about whether or not that should be allowed. But there are other, if not outright magic or divinatory practices in the Israelite and Judaic tradition, then certainly mystical practices. There's an entire ascent tradition stemming from the book of Ezekiel, stemming from the apocryphal book of 1 Enoch and the 2 books of Enoch following that. And then from that framework of holy texts, we have practices emerging later on of people like the Essenes who memorized the names of the angels governing the heavens, and then we have examples of an ascent tradition, which is part of the kind of esoteric underground of the Israelite world, where there were certain people who were actually trying to send their soul in what would today be described as path working or scrying or astral projection. They will send their souls up into the heavens to try and communicate with angelic beings and get information from them. And we actually have a line in one of the letters of Paul where he talks about how he, or not him, a friend of his, if you catch my drift, ascended up to the third heaven and saw things there. And we see echoes of the same ascent tradition coming down 1500 years later to the time of Dee and Kelly in their own attempts to contact the angels who spoke to Enoch and ascend or produce a system which would allow them to ascend through those heavens. So that's my video on magic in the Bible. I hope you enjoyed that. Not as clear-cut a question as it's often presented. Evangelical Christians, not only can you not practice any form of magic, but even Dungeons and Dragons and Pokemon are considered witchcraft, which will send you to hell. But hopefully that has presented a bit more light on this topic, where there's a lot of ignorant statements made by a lot of people. So if you enjoyed that, please like the video, subscribe to my channel to support my work, leave any comments you have down below. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.